you've tried everything. Therapy, boundaries, meditation, energy protection, even cutting off toxic relationships. You've read every book about being an empath, practiced every self-care technique, built walls around your energy, and yet, you're still drowning in other people's emotions, still depleting yourself for people who never reciprocate, still feeling like you're carrying the weight of everyone's pain except your own. Carl Jung discovered why nothing works. It's not because you're doing it wrong. It's because you're trying to heal while still clinging to the one thing that makes you feel significant. And releasing it feels like losing your entire identity. In 1923, Carl Jung treated a woman named Clara, who had been an empath her entire life. She'd absorbed everyone's pain until she couldn't feel her own emotions anymore. She'd tried every healing technique available in her time. Nothing worked. She was still drowning. Carl Jung told her something that shattered and liberated her in the same moment. You cannot heal as long as you cling to the belief that you matter only when carrying others' pain. Today, we're going to explore the most painful thing empaths must release to finally heal, and why every boundary technique fails until you let go of this hidden attachment. If you're an empath who's exhausted from absorbing everyone's emotions, and you're ready to understand the real psychology behind why you can't stop, subscribe to Inner Wise Woman and hit that notification bell. Because what we're exploring here isn't about managing your empath abilities better. It's about releasing the core wound that keeps you trapped in endless suffering. Your inner wise woman knows you need this truth. Clara came to Carl Jung at 38 years old, completely depleted. She'd been the family healer since childhood, the friend everyone called during crisis, the colleague who absorbed office tension, the partner who managed her husband's moods. She had no idea who she was when she wasn't helping someone. Every relationship in her life was built on her capacity to carry pain, and she was dying inside. Carl Jung saw immediately what Clara couldn't see. She wasn't suffering from being too sensitive. She was suffering from an addiction. Not to substances, but to being needed. Not to pleasure, but to pain. Specifically, to other people's pain. Because somewhere deep in her unconscious, she'd formed what Jung called the worth equation. The mathematical certainty that she was only lovable, only important, only significant when she was suffering for someone else. This wasn't conscious. Clara would have denied it if confronted directly, but Jung observed how she unconsciously sought out people in crisis, how she felt uncomfortable when things were peaceful, how she interpreted boundaries as selfishness and rest as laziness. Her entire identity was constructed around one core belief: I matter because I carry pain. Carl Jung identified 3 specific patterns that keep empaths trapped in endless suffering, patterns that Clara embodied perfectly. The first he called the rescue addiction, the compulsive need to seek out people in crisis to prove your importance by saving them. Clara couldn't sit still if someone around her was struggling. She would scan every room for distress, every conversation for hidden pain, every relationship for problems she could solve. This wasn't kindness, it was desperation. Because when there was no crisis to manage, no pain to absorb, no person to rescue, Clara felt empty, purposeless. Like she didn't exist. Jung helped her see that she was unconsciously attracted to broken people, chaotic situations, and unsolvable problems because they gave her a role, an identity, a reason to matter. Without someone to save, she had no idea who she was. The second pattern Jung called the suffering identity, defining yourself through the pain you absorb until you can't distinguish between your own experience and others' emotions. Clara would walk into a room and immediately feel everyone's anger, sadness, anxiety, and fear as if it were her own. But here's what Carl Jung discovered that changed everything. She wasn't just feeling their emotions. She was collecting them, storing them, building an identity out of them. Her sense of self had become so merged with others' suffering that peace felt like purposelessness. When things were calm, when people around her were happy, when there was no pain to absorb, Clara experienced it as a kind of death. She would unconsciously create drama or seek out suffering because stillness and joy felt like non-existence. Jung realized that Clara had confused empathy with merger, caring with absorption, helping with losing herself entirely. The third pattern was the most insidious. Jung called it the worth equation. The unconscious belief that your value as a human being is directly proportional to how much you suffer for others. For Clara, this equation was simple and brutal. If I'm not in pain for someone else, I am worthless. If I set a boundary, I am selfish. If I prioritize my needs, I am bad. This equation had been installed in childhood. Clara's mother had been chronically depressed, and young Clara learned that the only way to receive attention, approval, or love was to manage her mother's moods, absorb her mother's pain, and sacrifice her own needs entirely. The more she suffered, the more she mattered. The more she gave up, the more she was valued. By the time she reached adulthood, this equation was so deeply embedded in her unconscious that she couldn't imagine another way to exist. Carl Jung understood that all of Clara's healing attempts had failed because she was trying to set boundaries while keeping the attachment, trying to protect her energy while believing she was only important when giving it away, trying to stop absorbing pain while unconsciously seeking people who needed her to absorb it. She wasn't trying to heal. She was trying to suffer more efficiently. Jung's approach with Clara was radically different from anything she'd tried before. He didn't teach her better boundaries. He didn't give her energy protection techniques. He didn't help her manage her empathic abilities more effectively. Instead, he gave her what he called the worth test, a counterintuitive practice designed to prove that her significance existed independent of her suffering. The technique had 3 elements, and each one terrified Clara because it required her to do the one thing she'd never done: exist without being useful to someone else's pain. The first element Jung called identifying the equation. He taught Clara to catch herself in the moment when the unconscious belief arose: if I don't help right now, I am worthless. If I don't absorb this pain, I am selfish. If I don't rescue this person, I am bad. Every time Clara felt the compulsion to rescue, to absorb, to help, Jung had her pause and trace it back. Where did this equation come from? What was the original wound that taught her she only mattered when suffering for others? For Clara, it led back to her mother's depression, to the little girl who learned that love was conditional on her capacity to carry pain that wasn't hers. The second element was the most challenging. Jung called it testing the opposite. He instructed Clara to deliberately not rescue when she had the opportunity. When a friend called in crisis, when her husband was in a bad mood, when a colleague was struggling, Clara was to observe the impulse to help and then consciously choose not to act on it, not from cruelty, but from curiosity, to test whether she would actually cease to exist if she didn't intervene. This was excruciating for Clara. Every cell in her body screamed that she was being selfish, that she was abandoning people who needed her, that she was proving herself worthless. But Jung insisted she sit with the discomfort and observe what actually happened. And here's what Clara discovered over 6 months of practice. People figured things out without her help. Her relationships survived. The world didn't collapse. She didn't disappear. Her friend solved her own crisis. Her husband regulated his own mood. Her colleague found her own solution. And Clara remained. She existed. She mattered. Even when she wasn't suffering for anyone. This revelation shattered the core belief that had organized her entire life. The equation was false. She had worth independent of her usefulness to others' pain. The third element Jung called building new foundation. Discovering who you are when you're not suffering for anyone. This required Clara to spend time in stillness without the stimulation of others' drama, to practice receiving without reciprocating, to prove she deserved it, and most challenging of all, to experience enjoyment without guilt. Clara had never just enjoyed something. Every moment of pleasure was contaminated by the thought that someone else was suffering while she felt good. Every experience of peace was interrupted by scanning for who might need her. Jung helped her see that this constant vigilance wasn't empathy. It was a defense against feeling her own emptiness, against confronting the question, who am I when I'm not rescuing anyone? Jung understood that the answer to that question terrified empaths more than any external threat, because beneath the compulsion to help, beneath the addiction to being needed, beneath the identity built on suffering, there was a void. Not an empty void that needed to be filled with others' pain, but what Jung called the creative void, the open space where authentic self could finally emerge. Clara's journey through this void took months. There were moments when she wanted to abandon the process entirely and return to the familiar safety of codependency. At least when she was rescuing others, she knew who she was. At least when she was absorbing pain, she felt significant. This new territory of existing for herself, of mattering without utility, of being loved without earning it through suffering. It felt foreign, uncomfortable, even dangerous. Jung documented in his notes that Clara went through what he termed withdrawal symptoms from her rescue addiction. She experienced anxiety when people around her struggled and she didn't intervene. She felt guilt when she enjoyed something while others suffered. She battled the persistent belief that she was being selfish, that she was failing in her fundamental purpose as a person. But Jung encouraged her to stay with these feelings, to observe them without acting on them, to let them reveal their origins. What emerged on the other side was something Jung called empathy without codependency, the ability to feel with others without losing yourself in others. Clara's empathy didn't diminish through this process. It actually deepened, but it matured from unconscious merger into conscious compassion. She could still feel deeply, still care profoundly, still sense others' emotions. But she no longer needed their pain to feel like she mattered. She could witness suffering without absorbing it. She could care without depleting herself. She could help from overflow rather than from emptiness. This was the transformation Jung had seen in other patients who released the core empath wound. They became more effective helpers, not less, because they were no longer helping from a place of desperate need to prove their worth. The paradox Jung observed was that healing techniques fail empaths because they're trying to manage symptoms while keeping the disease. You're trying to set better boundaries while still believing you're only important when you have none. You're trying to protect your energy while unconsciously believing you're only lovable when you give it all away. You're trying to stop absorbing pain while secretly seeking people who need you to absorb it, because without that role, you don't know who you are. This is why meditation doesn't work, why boundaries feel impossible to maintain, why energy protection techniques fail, why cutting off toxic people just leads you to find new ones. You're not addressing the core attachment, the belief that your worth comes from your willingness to suffer for others. Until you release that, you're just rearranging furniture in a burning house. Jung's work with Clara revealed that the most painful thing empaths must release isn't actually other people's pain. It's the secret comfort of being needed. It's the hidden safety of having a role. It's the unconscious identity built on being the one who saves, who absorbs, who carries what others can't hold. Releasing this feels like dying because, in a sense, it is. The version of you that only exists through suffering for others must die, so the version that exists simply because you exist can finally live. Clara's transformation over those 6 months with Carl Jung was documented in his clinical notes. She reported that the first major shift came when she stopped checking on a friend who called weekly with the same crisis. For the first time in their 15-year friendship, Clara didn't call back immediately. She sat with the terror that she was abandoning someone who needed her. 3 days later, the friend called to say she'd figured it out on her own and actually felt proud of herself for the first time in years. This pattern repeated across Clara's life. Her husband, who had relied on her to manage his anxiety, learned to self-regulate when she stopped absorbing his emotions. Her adult children, who called her to solve every problem, developed their own problem-solving skills when she started saying, "I trust you to handle this." The people in her life didn't collapse without her constant intervention. They grew. And Clara discovered something revolutionary. Her help had sometimes been hindering their development. Carl Jung called this the helper's shadow, the unconscious ways that rescuing others can actually prevent their growth because it confirms their helplessness and your indispensability. Clara had to confront the uncomfortable truth that part of her needed people to stay broken so she could keep feeling necessary. This wasn't because she was a bad person. It was because her entire sense of worth was built on being needed, and people healing meant she might become irrelevant. If you're recognizing yourself in Clara's story, if you're seeing how you've been clinging to suffering as identity, subscribe to Inner Wise Woman, because we explore the real depth psychology of breaking these patterns. This isn't about becoming a better empath. It's about becoming a whole person who can feel deeply without losing herself completely. The question Carl Jung posed to Clara near the end of their work together was the question every empath must ultimately face. Can you matter without being useful? Can you be loved without earning it through suffering? Can you exist simply because you exist, not because you're carrying someone else's pain? For Clara, answering yes to these questions required dismantling everything she'd built her identity on. It required grieving the loss of her role as rescuer, even though that role had been destroying her. Jung noted that Clara went through a period of profound disorientation after releasing the core empath wound. She didn't know what to do with herself when she wasn't managing someone else's crisis. She felt guilty enjoying simple pleasures. She struggled with the space that opened up when she stopped filling every moment with others' needs. But gradually, something new emerged. A self that existed independent of utility. A worth that didn't require constant proof through suffering. By the end of their work together, Clara reported that she still felt others' emotions, but they no longer colonized her internal space. She could be present with someone's pain without making it her identity. She could offer help from genuine compassion rather than desperate need. She could say no without the crushing guilt that used to follow every boundary. Most remarkably, she discovered that she liked herself, not because of what she did for others, but simply because of who she was. Jung's final note in Clara's file stated, "Patient has achieved what few empaths accomplish, differentiation without disconnection. She feels deeply, but stands separately. She cares profoundly, but belongs to herself. The empath wound has healed not through better management, but through release of the core attachment that kept it open."